The bitter winter night clawed at my skin as I stumbled out of our small apartment, clutching a hastily packed duffel bag in one hand and my 6-year-old son, Lucas, in the other. He clung to my leg, his small frame shivering from both the cold and the fear that radiated through our home just moments ago. The sound of my husband Daniel's rage-filled voice still echoed in my ears, telling me never to come back. The sting of his hand across my cheek burned, a physical reminder of how quickly our lives had unraveled. I stood there for a moment, the shock of what had just happened washing over me in waves. It wasn't the first time Daniel had raised his voice or even his hand, but this time was different. This time, he'd crossed a line I couldn't ignore. All I had done was try to save our son's life, and for that, I was being cast out into the cold São Paulo night. Earlier that week, Lucas had fallen ill with a respiratory infection. At first, we thought it was just a common cold, but as the days passed, his coughing worsened, and his breathing became labored. I could see the fear in his eyes as he struggled for each breath, and it tore at my heart. We didn't have much money. Daniel's job at the local factory barely covered our rent and food, but I knew we had to do something. Against Daniel's wishes, I took the little money we had saved and went to see Dr. Ola, the kind-hearted physician at the community clinic. He examined Lucas with gentle hands and a furrowed brow. His diagnosis confirmed my worst fears. Pneumonia, he said, his voice grave. We need to start treatment immediately. Any delay could be dangerous. I nodded, fighting back tears as I clutched Lucas to my chest. Dr. Ola wrote out a prescription, his pen scratching against the paper in the quiet of the examination room. Maria, he said, looking at me over his glasses, I know times are tough, but this is critical. Make sure he takes every dose. I left the clinic with a heavy heart and an even heavier responsibility. The antibiotics weren't cheap, and I knew Daniel would be furious when he found out I'd spent our savings. But as I looked down at Lucas, his small hand in mine, his breathing raspy and uneven, I knew I had no choice. For 3 days, I managed to hide the medication from Daniel, giving Lucas his doses when my husband was at work or asleep. But on that fateful night, Daniel came home early, catching me in the act of measuring out the sticky pink liquid. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I tried to explain, my words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. "Lucas is sick, Daniel. The doctor said he needs this medicine." I had to. But Daniel wasn't listening. His face contorted with rage as he advanced on me, his voice rising with each step. "You went behind my back. Spent our money on some quack doctor and overpriced drugs? Who do you think you are?" I backed away, still clutching the bottle of medicine. "Please, Daniel, try to understand." Lucas needed. The slap came out of nowhere. The force of it sent me stumbling backward. The bottle slipped from my grasp, shattering on the worn linoleum floor. Pink liquid spread across the tiles like spilled blood. And in that moment, something inside me shattered too. Daniel stood over me, his chest heaving. "Clean this mess up," he spat. "And when you're done, get out. I won't have a disobedient wife under my roof." Now, standing in the cold night air with Lucas trembling against me, I felt a mix of fear and determination unlike anything I'd experienced before. I had no idea where we would go or what we would do, but I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't let Lucas see me crumble. "Mommy?" Lucas whimpered, his voice muffled against my coat. "Where are we going?" I knelt down, cupping his face in my hands. His cheeks were flushed with fever, and I could hear the rattle in his chest as he breathed. "We're going on an adventure, mu amore," I said, forcing a smile. "But first, we need to find a place to rest." We set off down the dimly lit street, the sounds of the city at night surrounding us. Dogs barked in the distance, and somewhere nearby, the beat of samba music pulsed from an open window. On any other night, these might have been the comforting sounds of our neighborhood. Tonight, they felt alien and threatening. I walked without a real destination in mind, one foot in front of the other, Lucas's hand clasped tightly in mine. My mind raced, considering and discarding options. My parents lived hours away in the countryside, and I had no money for bus fare. Most of my friends were really Daniel's friends, and I couldn't risk going to them for help. As we turned a corner, I saw a familiar sign that made my heart leap. Casa de Esperanza, the local women's shelter. I had walked past it countless times on my way to the market, never imagining I would one day be seeking refuge there myself. The shelter was a nondescript building, its windows dark save for a single light burning by the entrance. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the worn brass door handle. Was this really happening? Was I really about to admit defeat? To acknowledge that my marriage had crumbled beyond repair? Lucas's cough, harsh and racking, broke through my indecision. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about keeping my son safe and healthy. I pushed open the door, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the chill of the night. A woman looked up from a desk, her eyes widening as she took in our disheveled appearance. Bonne nuit, she said softly, rising from her chair. Can I help you? The kindness in her voice was my undoing. Tears that I had been holding back for hours, maybe even years, began to fall. Please, I managed to choke out. We need help. The next few hours passed in a blur. The woman, who introduced herself as Fernanda, got us settled in a small room with 2 narrow beds. She brought us warm blankets and a meal for Lucas, chicken soup that steamed in the bowl, its aroma filling the room with memories of safer, happier times. As Lucas ate, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and illness, Fernanda gently asked me what had happened. I found myself pouring out the whole story, not just of that night, but of the past 2 years. I told her about Daniel's increasing impatience, how his temper had begun to manifest in harsh words and slammed doors. I spoke of my own self-doubt, how I'd convinced myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that if I just tried harder, loved more, things would get better. Fernanda listened without judgment, her hand resting comfortingly on mine. When I finished, she looked at me with eyes full of understanding. Mara, she said, what happened to you is not your fault. You did the right thing by coming here. Those words, so simple and yet so powerful, broke something loose inside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to really feel the weight of what I'd been through, what I'd escaped. I cried until I had no tears left, Fernanda's arm around my shoulders grounding me. When I finally calmed, Fernanda helped me get Lucas settled into bed. His breathing was still labored, and I knew he would need to see a doctor again soon. But for now, he was safe, and that was what mattered. As I lay in the narrow bed beside my son, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the shelter around us, I stared at the cracked paint on the ceiling. Questions assaulted my mind, each one more daunting than the last. What would we do tomorrow? How would I provide for Lucas on my own? Would Daniel come looking for us? But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a small, growing spark of something else, hope, maybe, or determination. I had taken the first step toward a new life, one where my son's well-being came first. It wouldn't be easy, but as I drifted off to sleep, Lucas's small hand clasped in mine, I knew that somehow, we would find a way forward. The night passed fitfully, punctuated by Lucas's coughing and the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the shelter. But as the first light of dawn began to filter through the thin curtains, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. We had survived the night. We had taken the first step. And whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek through the curtains when I woke up, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and I felt a wave of emotions crash over me, fear, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. I looked over at Lucas, still sleeping fitfully beside me, his breathing raspy but steady. As I lay there, trying to gather my thoughts, a soft knock at the door startled me. It was Fernanda, the kind woman who had welcomed us last night. Bom dia, Maria, she said softly, stepping into the room. How are you and Lucas doing this morning? I sat up, running a hand through my tangled hair. We okay, I replied, not quite sure if it was true. Lucas is still not well, though. I'm worried about his cough. Fernanda nodded sympathetically. We have a nurse who comes in every morning to check on the residents. She'll be here soon, and we'll make sure Lucas is seen first. As if on cue, Lucas stirred and opened his eyes, immediately starting to cough. I helped him sit up, rubbing his back as he struggled to catch his breath. Fernanda disappeared and returned moments later with a glass of water and some tissues. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Beatrice, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, arrived shortly after. She examined Lucas thoroughly, her brow furrowed in concentration. The antibiotics are helping, she said finally, but we need to continue the treatment. I'll write a prescription, and we'll get it filled at the community pharmacy. I felt a lump form in my throat. I don't have any money, I admitted, the shame of my situation washing over me anew. Beatrice patted my hand gently. Don't worry about that now. We have a fund for emergency medical needs. The important thing is to get Lucas healthy. As Beatrice left to get the prescription filled, Fernanda suggested I get some breakfast and then meet with Clara, the shelter's social worker. She can help you understand your options and plan your next steps, Fernanda explained. The shelter's common area was beginning to fill with other women and children as I made my way to the small kitchen. Some looked as shell-shocked as I felt, while others moved with the practiced ease of those who had been here for a while. A young woman with a baby on her hip smiled at me as I entered the kitchen. You're new here, aren't you? She asked, her voice friendly. I'm Gabriella. This is my daughter, Sophia. Maria, I replied, managing a small smile in return. My son, Lucas, is upstairs. He's not feeling well. Gabriella's face softened with understanding. The first few days are the hardest, she said, bouncing Sophia gently. But you're not alone here. We look out for each other. As we talked over cups of strong coffee and simple cheese bread, I felt some of the tension begin to ease from my shoulders. Gabriella shared her own story, how she had fled an abusive boyfriend when she found out she was pregnant, how the shelter had helped her find a job and an apartment of her own. It's not easy, she admitted, but it's better than living in fear. And Sophia deserves a life free from violence. Her words struck a chord deep within me. Wasn't that exactly what I wanted for Lucas? A life where he didn't have to walk on eggshells? Where he could grow and thrive without the shadow of his father's anger looming over him? After breakfast, I met with Clara, the social worker. Her office was small but cozy, with colorful posters about women's rights and domestic violence resources on the walls. Clara herself was a warm, motherly woman with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Maria, she began gently, can you tell me a bit about what brought you to us? And so, for the second time in less than 24 hours, I found myself recounting the story of my marriage to Daniel. This time, though, it was different. As I spoke, Clara asked questions that made me think about things in a new light. When did Daniel's behavior start to change? She asked. I thought back, trying to pinpoint the moment. I guess it was about 2 years ago, I said slowly. He lost his job at the factory, and it took him a while to find a new one. He started drinking more, staying out late. When he was home, he was always angry, always finding fault with everything I did. Clara nodded, making notes. And when did the physical abuse start? I flinched at the word abuse, it seemed so harsh, so final. But wasn't that exactly what it was? The first time he hit me was about a year ago, I admitted, the memory flooding back. I had burned dinner, and he slapped me across the face. He apologized right after, said it would never happen again. But it did. As we talked, Clara helped me see patterns I had been blind to before, the way Daniel had isolated me from my friends and family, how he controlled our finances, how he made me doubt my own judgment. Slowly, I began to understand that what had happened wasn't my fault. Maria, Clara said, leaning forward, her eyes serious, what Daniel did to you and Lucas is a crime. You have the right to press charges, to seek a restraining order. We can help you with the legal process if that's what you want. The idea of taking legal action against Daniel terrified me. What if he became even angrier? What if he tried to take Lucas away from me? But as I thought about Lucas, the fear in his eyes when Daniel shouted, how he flinched at sudden movements, I knew I had to do something. I think I want to file a report, I said, my voice shaky but determined. Not just for me. For Lucas. He deserves better. Clara smiled, a mix of pride and sadness in her eyes. That's a brave decision, Maria. It won't be easy, but we'll be here to support you every step of the way. Over the next few days, a whirlwind of activity surrounded us. Lucas's health improved with the continued antibiotics, and I watched with relief as the color returned to his cheeks and his breathing eased. I filed a police report, my hands shaking as I recounted the events of that night and the years leading up to it. The officer who took my statement was kind but businesslike, assuring me that they would investigate. Clara helped me file for emergency custody of Lucas and a temporary restraining order against Daniel. The legal jargon was confusing, but Clara patiently explained everything, making sure I understood each step of the process. Through it all, the support of the other women at the shelter was a lifeline. They shared their stories, offered advice, and watched Lucas when I had appointments. Gabriella, in particular, became a close friend, her strength and resilience inspiring me to keep going when things felt overwhelming. One afternoon, about a week after we had arrived at the shelter, I was returning from a meeting with a pro bono lawyer Clara had connected me with. As I turned the corner onto the street where the shelter was located, I froze. There, leaning against a lamppost, was Daniel. My heart began to race, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. He hadn't seen me yet. I ducked back around the corner, pressing myself against the wall of a building. What was he doing here? How had he found us? As I stood there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I heard Daniel's voice, low and menacing, as he spoke to someone passing by. Have you seen a woman with a little boy? Dark hair, about this tall? They're my family, and I'm worried about them. The passerby murmured something I couldn't hear, and Daniel's footsteps moved away. I waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, before I dared to peek around the corner again. The street was empty. Shaking, I made my way back to the shelter, looking over my shoulder every few steps. When I burst through the door, Fernanda took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. Maria, what happened? Daniel, I gasped out. He was outside. He's looking for us. Fernanda's face hardened. She immediately went into action, calling the police and then gathering the other staff members. They implemented what they called their safety protocol, making sure all the doors were locked and all the women and children were accounted for. As the initial panic subsided, I sat in the common room, Lucas curled up beside me, his small hand clutching mine tightly. The reality of our situation hit me anew. This wasn't just about escaping one bad night or even years of abuse. This was about rebuilding our entire lives. About creating a future where we could be safe and happy. Clara found me there, her face serious but calm. Maria, she said, sitting down beside me. I know this is scary, but remember, you're not alone in this. We're here to protect you and Lucas, and we will do everything in our power to keep you safe. As I nodded, trying to hold back tears, I felt Lucas squeeze my hand. I looked down at him, at his trusting face and brave little smile, and I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. We had taken the first steps toward a new life, and there was no going back now. Only forward, into whatever future we could build for ourselves. The weeks following Daniel's appearance near the shelter were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Each day brought new challenges, but also small victories that I clung to like lifelines in a stormy sea. The shelter became our safe haven, a place where Lucas and I could breathe without fear, even as we prepared for the battle that lay ahead. Clara, our guardian angel in social worker's clothing, guided us through the complex legal process. She connected me with Alice, a pro bono lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases. Alice was a force of nature, her determination and confidence giving me strength when my own faltered. "Maria," Alice said during our first meeting, her dark eyes intense, "I want you to understand something. What happened to you and Lucas wasn't your fault. You have rights, and we're going to fight for them." As she laid out our strategy, I felt a mix of hope and trepidation. We would be seeking full custody of Lucas, a permanent restraining order against Daniel, and financial support for Lucas's care. It sounded simple when Alice said it, but I knew the reality would be far more complicated. The days blurred together in a haze of paperwork, meetings, and preparation. I learned legal terms I never thought I'd need to know, words like affidavit and deposition, becoming part of my daily vocabulary. All the while, I tried to shield Lucas from the worst of it, to give him some semblance of normalcy in the midst of our upheaval. Lucas, my brave little soldier, seemed to sense the gravity of our situation. He rarely complained, even when we had to move to a different room in the shelter for security reasons after Daniel's appearance. His resilience amazed me, and I drew strength from his unwavering trust in me. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, Lucas looked up at me with those big, serious eyes of his. "Mommy," he said softly, "are we ever going back home?" My heart clenched at his question. How could I explain to a 6-year-old that the place we once called home was no longer safe for us? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Lucas, muamo," I began, stroking his hair. "Home isn't just a place, it's where we feel safe and loved. Right now, this is our home. And someday soon, we'll have a new home, just for you and me." He nodded, seeming to understand more than his years should allow. "As long as we're together, right, Mommy?" I hugged him tightly, blinking back tears. "That's right, Cuero. As long as we're together, we're home." As the court date approached, the tension in the air grew thick. I threw myself into preparation, working with Alice to gather evidence and build our case. We collected medical records documenting Lucas's illness and my injuries, statements from neighbors who had witnessed Daniel's outbursts, and even a few brave friends were willing to testify about the changes they'd seen in me over the years. But for every step forward, it seemed Daniel was there to push us 2 steps back. He contested every motion, denied every allegation. His lawyer, a slick man in expensive suits, painted me as an unstable mother who had overreacted to a minor domestic dispute. The worst came one afternoon as I was leaving the courthouse after filing some paperwork. I heard his voice before I saw him, that once familiar tone now sending chills down my spine. "Maria," Daniel called, his voice deceptively calm. I turned to see him leaning against a nearby car, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. "Don't you think this has gone on long enough?" I froze, my heart pounding. We were in a public place, broad daylight, but fear still gripped me. "Daniel," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "You shouldn't be here." "The restraining order." He waved his hand dismissively. "That piece of paper doesn't mean anything. We both know this is all a misunderstanding. Why don't you come home? We can work this out, for Lucas's sake." The mention of our son's name snapped me out of my fear. I straightened my spine, looking Daniel in the eye. "There's nothing to work out. Lucas and I are not coming back. Please, just leave us alone." I turned to walk away, but his next words stopped me cold. "You think you can do this on your own?" he sneered. "You're nothing without me, Maria. No judge is going to side with a woman who can't even take care of her own child without running to a shelter." I didn't turn back, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how his words affected me. Instead, I walked away, my steps quickening until I was almost running. It wasn't until I was safely back at the shelter that I allowed myself to break down, sobs racking my body as Gabriella held me. That night, after Lucas was asleep, I sat with Clara and Alice, recounting what had happened. Alice's face was grim as she took notes. "This is good, Maria," she said, seeing my confusion. I know it doesn't feel that way, but Daniel just violated the restraining order. We can use this. Clara nodded in agreement. You're stronger than he thinks, Maria. Stronger than you know. You've come so far already. Their words buoyed me, but doubt still nagged at the edges of my mind. Was I really strong enough to see this through? Could I really build a life for Lucas and me on my own? As the final days before the trial ticked by, I threw myself into preparation. Alice and I went over my testimony again and again, rehearsing every possible question the defense might ask. We prepared for Daniel's tactics, his attempts to discredit me or twist the truth. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I paced the small room Lucas and I shared, my mind racing with all the possible outcomes. What if the judge didn't believe me? What if Daniel convinced them that I was the unfit parent? The thought of losing Lucas, of him being forced to live with Daniel's anger and unpredictability, was unbearable. In the pre-dawn hours, exhausted and overwhelmed, I found myself in the shelter's small chapel. I wasn't particularly religious, but something about the quiet, sacred space called to me. I sat in one of the worn wooden pews, head bowed, and let the tears come. Please, I whispered to whoever might be listening, give me strength. For Lucas. For myself. As I sat there, the first light of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows, painting the chapel in soft hues of gold and rose. And with that light came a sense of calm, a quiet determination that settled over me like a warm blanket. I thought of all we had been through, of the strength I had found within myself that I never knew I possessed. I thought of Lucas, his resilience and his unwavering faith in me. And I knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep within, that we would get through this. When I returned to our room, Lucas was just waking up. He rubbed his eyes sleepily, then looked at me with a small smile. Is today the day, Mommy? He asked. I sat on the edge of his bed, pulling him into a hug. Yes, Muaimo. Today is the day we tell our story. As we got dressed, I, in the one nice outfit I had managed to bring with me, and Lucas, in his cleanest shirt, I felt a strange mix of nervousness and determination. This was it. The moment that would determine our future. Before we left, Gabriella appeared at our door, Sophia on her hip. We'll be thinking of you, she said, giving me a fierce hug. You've got this, Maria. Other women from the shelter gathered in the common room as we prepared to leave, each offering words of encouragement or small gestures of support, a squeeze of the hand, a pat on the back. Their belief in me, in our cause, bolstered my resolve. As Clara drove us to the courthouse, the city coming to life around us, I held Lucas's hand tightly. Whatever happened today, we would face it together. We had come too far, overcome too much, to give up now. The courthouse loomed before us, its stone facade imposing in the morning light. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. This was more than just a trial. This was our chance to reclaim our lives, to stand up against the fear and abuse that had held us captive for too long. Ready? Clara asked, her hand on my shoulder. I looked down at Lucas, then back at the courthouse. With a nod, I stepped forward. Ready. As we climbed the steps, I felt a strength I hadn't known before. We were no longer victims fleeing in the night. We were survivors, ready to fight for the future we deserved. The storm had brought us here, but it was our strength that would see us through. And whatever the outcome, I knew one thing for certain, Lucas and I would face it together, stronger for all we had endured. The courthouse loomed before us, its imposing facade a mix of old-world grandeur and intimidating authority. As we climbed the wide stone steps, my hand clutching Lucas's tightly, I felt as though I was walking into the lion's den. My heart raced, and I could feel beads of sweat forming on my brow, despite the cool morning air. Clara and Alice flanked us, their presence a comforting buffer against the chaos of the bustling courthouse. As we passed through security, the metal detector's beep made me jump. The guard gave me a reassuring smile as he waved us through, but it did little to calm my nerves. In the crowded hallway outside the courtroom, Alice pulled us aside for a final briefing. Her voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the tumult in my mind. "Remember, Maria," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "Just tell the truth. Your story is powerful, let it speak for itself." I nodded, trying to draw strength from her confidence. Lucas tugged at my hand, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mommy," he whispered, "is Papa going to be here?" The innocent question sent a jolt through me. How could I explain to my 6-year-old son the complexities of what was about to unfold? I knelt down to his level, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Yes, Cuero," I said softly. "Your father will be here. But remember, no matter what happens, you and I are a team, okay?" Lucas nodded solemnly, squeezing my hand. His trust in me was both heartening and terrifying. I couldn't let him down. As we waited, I saw Daniel arrived with his lawyer. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his hair neatly combed, looking every inch the respectable businessman. Our eyes met across the hallway, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His face was a mask of calm, but I could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Before I could dwell on it, the courtroom doors opened. "It's time," Alice murmured, guiding us forward. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, but no less intimidating. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the judge's bench loomed high above the rest of the room. As we took our seats, I could feel the weight of eyes upon us, the court officials, the few spectators, and, most pressingly, Daniel and his lawyer. Judge Elena Ramirez entered, her black robes swishing as she took her seat. Her face was stern but not unkind as she surveyed the room. "Court is now in session," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. What followed was a blur of legal procedures, opening statements, presentations of evidence, testimonies from witnesses. I listened as neighbors recounted Daniel's angry outbursts, as Dr. Oliveira detailed Lucas's illness and my efforts to get him treatment. With each testimony, I felt a strange mix of validation and shame. Yes, this all happened. But how had I let it go on for so long? When it was my turn to testify, Alice gave my hand a reassuring squeeze before I made my way to the witness stand. As I swore to tell the truth, my voice trembled, but I forced myself to stand tall. This was my moment to be heard. I recounted our story, the gradual escalation of Daniel's behavior, the constant fear, the night he threw us out. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, fueled by the need to make them understand, to protect Lucas from ever experiencing such fear again. "Mrs. Martins," Daniel's lawyer began during cross-examination, his voice smooth as oil, "isn't it true that you spent money on medical treatment for your son against your husband's wishes?" "Yes," I replied, my chin held high, because my son's health was at risk. "And you don't think a father has the right to have a say in his child's medical treatment?" I took a deep breath, remembering Alice's coaching. "A father absolutely has that right," I said carefully, "but not the right to deny necessary treatment, especially when a doctor has said it's urgent." The questions continued, each designed to paint me as irresponsible, unstable, or manipulative. But with each answer, I felt a growing sense of strength. These were my truths, and no amount of clever wordplay could change them. As I stepped down from the witness stand, my legs were shaky, but my head was held high. I caught Lucas's eye. He gave me a small smile and a thumbs up, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what the legal outcome, we had already won something precious, our freedom from fear. Then, it was Daniel's turn to testify. As he took the stand, I steeled myself for what was to come. His lawyer led him through a carefully crafted narrative, a hard-working father, a loving husband, a man who had perhaps made some mistakes but was fundamentally good. "Mr. Martins," his lawyer asked, "can you tell us about the night your wife left with your son?" Daniel's face took on a pained expression that I knew all too well, the look he used when he wanted sympathy. "It was a misunderstanding," he said, his voice soft and regretful. "We had an argument, yes, but I never meant for them to leave. I was worried sick when I realized they were gone. I gripped the edge of my seat, fighting the urge to shout out the truth. Alice placed a calming hand on my arm, reminding me to let the process play out. As Alice cross-examined Daniel, she methodically picked apart his story, exposing the inconsistencies and half-truths. She presented evidence of his controlling behavior, of the times he had prevented me from seeking medical care for myself or Lucas. With each question, I could see Daniel's calm facade cracking, the familiar anger beginning to simmer beneath the surface. Finally, Alice asked, "Mr. Martins, can you explain why you were seen near the women's shelter where your wife and son were staying, in direct violation of the temporary restraining order?" Daniel's composure slipped. "I had every right to see my son," he snapped, his voice rising. "She can't keep him from me." A murmur ran through the courtroom at his outburst. Judge Ramirez's gavel came down sharply. "Mr. Martins," she warned, "control yourself, or you will be held in contempt." As Daniel struggled to regain his composure, I saw a flicker of something in Judge Ramirez's eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the man behind the careful facade. The rest of the trial passed in a haze of legal arguments and final statements. As we waited for Judge Ramirez to return with her decision, the courtroom was thick with tension. Lucas leaned against me, tired and confused by the long day of adult talk he couldn't fully understand. I stroked his hair, whispering reassurances I wasn't sure I believed myself. When Judge Ramirez re-entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. This was the moment that would determine our future. "In the matter of Martins versus Martins," Judge Ramirez began, her voice steady and clear, "I have carefully considered all the evidence presented. This court takes very seriously the safety and well-being of children, as well as the right of individuals to live free from fear and abuse." She paused, her eyes sweeping the courtroom before settling on me. "Mrs. Martins, the court finds your testimony credible and your actions in protecting your son commendable. Mr. Martins, your behavior, both in and out of this courtroom, has demonstrated a disturbing pattern of control and disregard for the well-being of your family." Held my breath, scarcely daring to hope as Judge Ramirez continued. "Therefore, it is the decision of this court to grant full custody of Lucas Martins to his mother, Maria Martins. Furthermore, the temporary restraining order against Daniel Martins is to be made permanent." The rest of the judge's words washed over me in a wave of relief and disbelief. She outlined the terms of child support, the specifics of the custody arrangement, the consequences if Daniel violated the restraining order. But all I could focus on was the realization that it was over. We were free. As the court was adjourned, I pulled Lucas into a tight hug, tears streaming down my face. "We did it, Muamo," I whispered. "We're going to be okay." Clara and Alice surrounded us, their faces beaming with joy and pride. But as we prepared to leave the courtroom, I heard Daniel's voice, low and menacing. "This isn't over, Maria. You can't keep my son from me forever." Before I could respond, Judge Ramirez's voice cut through the air. "Mr. Martins," she said, her tone sharp, "I advise you to think very carefully about your next actions. This court's rulings are not suggestions, and I will not hesitate to enforce them to the fullest extent of the law." Daniel fell silent, his face a mask of barely contained rage as he stormed out of the courtroom. I felt the last of my fear dissolving. We had faced the storm, and we had come out stronger. As we left the courthouse, stepping into the warm afternoon sun, I felt as though a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy, I knew, but for the first time in years, I could see a future full of hope and possibility. Lucas looked up at me, his eyes bright. "Mommy," he said, "are we going home now?" I smiled, my heart full of love for my brave little boy. "Yes, Muamo," I replied. "We're going home, to our new beginning." As we prepared to leave the courtroom, the weight of Judge Ramirez's decision still settling over us like a warm blanket, I heard Daniel's voice cut through the air. It was low, menacing, a tone I knew all too well from our years together. "This isn't over, Maria. You can't keep my son from me forever." I froze, my hand instinctively tightening around Lucas's. For a moment, all the old fears came rushing back, threatening to overwhelm the fragile sense of victory we'd just achieved. But before I could respond, before the panic could fully take hold, another voice rang out, clear, authoritative, and brooking no argument. "Mr. Martins," Judge Ramirez said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass, "I advise you to think very carefully about your next actions." I turned to see the judge still at her bench, her eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made even me want to shrink back. She wasn't done. "This court's rulings are not suggestions," she continued, each word deliberate and heavy with meaning. "They are legally binding decisions, and I will not hesitate to enforce them to the fullest extent of the law. Is that understood?" The courtroom had fallen silent, all eyes on the tableau before us. Daniel, his face a mask of barely contained rage, seemed to deflate under the judge's unyielding gaze. It was a sight I never thought I'd see, Daniel cowed by someone else's authority. "Furthermore," Judge Ramirez went on, her voice slightly softer but no less firm, "I want to make something very clear. What I've witnessed in this courtroom today goes beyond a simple domestic dispute. Mr. Martins, your behavior, both in your home and here in my courtroom, demonstrates a pattern of control, intimidation, and disregard for the well-being of your family that I find deeply troubling." She paused, letting her words sink in. I could see Daniel's lawyer shifting uncomfortably beside him, clearly wanting to intervene but not daring to interrupt the judge. "In my years on the bench," Judge Ramirez continued, "I've seen far too many cases like this, cases where fear and control masquerade as love and protection, where children grow up believing that violence and intimidation are normal parts of family life. Not in my courtroom. Not on my watch." Her gaze softened slightly as it moved to me and "Lucas, Mrs. Martins," Judge Ramirez said, her voice steady, "I want you to know that you've done the right thing here today. It takes immense courage to stand up to abuse, to protect yourself and your child. The road ahead won't be easy, but you've taken the first and most important step." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, overwhelmed by the judge's words. For so long, I had doubted myself, questioned whether I was overreacting, whether I was somehow to blame for Daniel's behavior. To hear this validation, this affirmation that I had done the right thing, was more powerful than I could have imagined. Judge Ramirez turned her attention back to Daniel. "Mr. Martins, I strongly suggest you take this opportunity to reflect on your actions and their consequences. This court has ordered you to attend anger management classes and counseling. I urge you to take these seriously, not just as requirements to fulfill, but as genuine opportunities for change." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a note of something almost like compassion. "Being a father is about more than biology or legal rights. It's about love, support, and creating a safe environment for your child to grow and thrive. If you truly want to be a part of your son's life, you need to demonstrate that you can be the kind of father he deserves." Daniel's face was a storm of emotions, anger, shame, defiance, and something that might have been regret flickering across his features. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, before the anger and control had taken over. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a hard, blank mask. "Court is adjourned," Judge Ramirez declared, bringing down her gavel with a resounding crack. As we filed out of the courtroom, I felt as though I was walking in a dream. The reality of what had just happened, of our victory, of the judge's words, of the new future suddenly stretching out before us, was almost too much to process. Clara and Alice flanked us as we made our way through the courthouse corridors, their presence a buffer against the curious looks and whispers that followed us. Lucas clung to my hand, quiet but watchful, his young mind no doubt trying to make sense of the adult drama that had just unfolded. Outside, the late afternoon sun was warm on my face, a stark contrast to the chill of the air-conditioned courthouse. I took a deep breath, feeling as though I was truly breathing freely for the first time in years. "Maria," Alice said, her voice gentle, "I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. You stood up for yourself and for Lucas today. You've given yourself a chance at a new life. Clara nodded in agreement. Judge Ramirez was right. The road ahead won't be easy, but you've already shown incredible strength. And remember, you're not alone in this. We'll be here to support you every step of the way. Their words washed over me, a soothing balm to the raw emotions of the day. I looked down at Lucas, who was watching me with those big, trusting eyes of his. What do you think, Muaimo? I asked softly. Ready for our new adventure? Lucas nodded. Solemnly, he said. Together, right, Mommy? Always together, I promised, pulling him close. As we made our way down the courthouse steps, I spotted a familiar face in the crowd, Gabriella, with little Sophia on her hip. She rushed over, enveloping me in a one-armed hug. I couldn't stay away, she explained, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I had to know what happened. Briefly, I recounted the events in the courtroom, the testimonies, the judge's decision, her powerful words to Daniel. Gabriella listened, her face a mix of joy and fierce pride. You did it, Maria, she said, squeezing my arm. You really did it. We did it, I corrected her, including her and all the other women at the shelter who had supported us in that simple pronoun. I couldn't have done it without all of you. As we stood there, this strange little family brought together by circumstance and shared struggle, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in a long time, hope. Pure, unbridled hope for the future. The sound of raised voices caught our attention across the plaza. Daniel was engaged in a heated argument with his lawyer. Even from a distance, I could see the familiar signs of his temper rising, the clenched fists, the rigid set of his shoulders. For a moment, I tensed, the old fear rising up. But then I remembered Judge Ramirez's words. The power of the court order now protecting us. Let's go home, I said, turning away from the scene. Home. Not the apartment filled with painful memories, but the shelter that had become our safe haven. Soon, we would need to think about finding a new place to live, about rebuilding our lives from the ground up. But for now, the shelter was home. As we walked away from the courthouse, Lucas's hand in mine and surrounded by friends who had become like family, I felt lighter than I had in years. The road ahead was uncertain, yes. But for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where it might lead. That night, back in our small room at the shelter, I sat on the edge of Lucas's bed, watching him sleep. His face was peaceful, free from the worry and fear that had become all too familiar in recent months. I thought about all we had been through, all the challenges still ahead of us. But mostly, I thought about Judge Ramirez's words. Not in my courtroom, she had said. Not on my watch. In that moment, I made a promise to myself and to Lucas. No more fear. No more control. No more accepting anything less than the love and respect we deserved. We had taken the first step toward a new life, and I was determined to make it count. As I kissed Lucas's forehead and climbed into my own bed, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. But tonight, we were safe. We were together. And for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep with a smile on my face, dreaming of the future we would build together. The weeks following the trial passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Each day brought new challenges, but also small victories that I cherished. The shelter, which had been our safe haven in the storm, now felt like a cocoon from which we were slowly emerging, ready to spread our wings. Clara, ever our guardian. Angel helped us navigate the complex world of social services. There were forms to fill out, appointments to keep, and a myriad of decisions to make. It was overwhelming at times, but I was determined to build a stable future for Lucas and me. One sunny morning, about a month after the trial, Clara arrived at the shelter with a smile that lit up her entire face. Maria, she said, barely containing her excitement, I have some news. We found an apartment for you and Lucas. My heart leaped at her words. An apartment of our own. It seemed almost too good to be true. Really? I asked, hardly daring to believe it. Clara nodded, her eyes twinkling. It's small, and it's in a different neighborhood, but it's clean, safe, and within your budget. Plus, she added with a wink, it's close to a good school for Lucas. Tears welled up in my eyes as the reality of this new beginning truly sank in. We were really doing this. We were really starting over. Lucas was ecstatic when I told him the news. Our own place, Mommy? He asked, his eyes wide with wonder. With my own room? I nodded, pulling him into a tight hug. That's right, Muimo. Our very own home. The day we moved into our new apartment was both exciting and terrifying. Our belongings fit into just a few boxes, reminders of how little we had, but also of how little we needed. The apartment was indeed small, just a bedroom, a tiny living room, and a kitchenette, but to us, it was a palace. As we unpacked, placing our few possessions around the space, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. This was ours. We had earned this. Lucas ran from room to room, his excitement infectious. Look, Mommy, he called out. I can see the park from my window. I joined him at the window, wrapping my arm around his shoulders. The view wasn't much, a small neighborhood park with a few trees and a playground, but to us, it was a vista of possibilities. That night, after Lucas had fallen asleep in his new bed, I sat in our tiny living room, sipping a cup of tea and reflecting on how far we'd come. The past few months had been the hardest of my life. But they had also shown me a strength I never knew I possessed. A soft knock at the door startled me from my reverie. I opened it to find Gabriella standing there, a homemade cake in her hands and Sophia on her hip. Surprise, she said with a grin. Housewarming gift. I ushered them in, touched by the gesture. As we sat eating cake and chatting, Gabriella looked around the apartment with approval. It's a good start, Maria, she said. You should be proud of yourself. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I am, I admitted. But I'm also scared. There's still so much to figure out. Gabriella reached across the table, squeezing my hand. That's normal. But look how far you've come already. You're stronger than you know. Her words stayed with me long after she and Sophia had left. I was stronger than I knew. We both were, Lucas and I. The next few months were a whirlwind of new experiences and adjustments. I found a job at a local bakery, working early morning shifts so I could be home when Lucas finished school. The hours were long, and the work was hard, but there was a satisfaction in earning my own money, in providing for my son through my own efforts. Lucas started at his new school, and I watched with pride as he made friends and threw himself into his studies. There were difficult days, of course, days when he missed his old home, his old life. Days when he asked about Daniel, his young mind struggling to understand the complexities of our situation. On one such day, as we walked home from school, Lucas looked up at me with those serious eyes of his. Mommy, he said, his voice small, does Papa not love us anymore? Is that why we don't see him? My heart clenched at his words. How could I explain the complexities of love and hurt, of fear and healing, to a child? I knelt down, meeting his gaze. Lucas, Muimo, I began carefully, your father, he has some things he needs to work on, things that made it unsafe for us to be with him. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. Lucas nodded slowly, processing my words. But we're safe now, right, Mommy? I pulled him into a tight hug. Yes, Cito. We're safe now. As the months passed, we settled into our new routine. Our apartment slowly became a home, filled with Lucas's artwork, books from the local library, and small treasures we found together at weekend flea markets. It wasn't much, but it was ours. And it was filled with love. I made friends with some of the other parents at Lucas's school, and slowly, our world began to expand. We were invited to birthday parties and playdates. I joined a support group for single mothers, finding strength and solidarity in sharing our stories. One evening, as I was closing up the bakery, my boss, Dona Eliza, approached me. She was a kind woman in her 60s, with laughter lines around her eyes and flour perpetually dusting her apron. "Maria," she said, her tone serious, "I've been watching you these past months. You're a hard worker, and you have a real talent for baking." I felt myself blush at her praise. "Thank you, Dona Eliza. I enjoy the work." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "How would you feel about learning more? I could teach you some of my special recipes, show you more about running the business side of things." My heart raced at her words. Was she offering what I thought she was offering? I would love that," I stammered. Dona Eliza's smile widened. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. Who knows? Maybe someday this place could be yours." As I walked home that night, my mind was spinning with possibilities. For so long, I had been focused solely on survival, on getting through each day. Now, for the first time, I was allowing myself to dream of a future. A future where I wasn't just surviving, but thriving. When I got home, Lucas was waiting up for me, a book clutched in his hands. "Mommy," he said excitedly, "can we read together?" I scooped him up, planting a kiss on his forehead. "Of course, Muimo. Let's read." As we snuggled on the couch, Lucas's warm weight against my side, I felt a profound sense of peace. Our life wasn't perfect. We still had challenges to face, wounds that were still healing. But we were together. We were safe. And we were building a life filled with love and hope. Later that night, as I tucked Lucas into bed, he looked up at me with a sleepy smile. "Mommy," he murmured. "I'm happy." Tears pricked at my eyes as I smoothed his hair back. "Me too, Cuero," I whispered. "Me too." As I closed his bedroom door, I paused for a moment, overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude. We had come so far from that terrifying night when we fled our old life. We had faced our fears, weathered the storm, and emerged stronger. I thought of Judge Ramirez and her powerful words in the courtroom. I thought of Clara and Alice, of Gabriela, and all the women at the shelter who had supported us. I thought of Dona Eliza and her faith in me. And I thought of Lucas, my brave, resilient boy who had been my strength even when I felt I had none left. We still had a long road ahead of us. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But as I looked around our small apartment, filled with the evidence of our new life, I knew we could face whatever came our way. This was our new chapter, and we were writing it together, one day at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what the next page would bring.